this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. From late 1944, an ungainly piece of equipment was introduced into service in the British and Canadian armies. Referred to at the time as the Valentine 17-pounder SP and later the Archer, it was a tracked vehicle with an open compartment at the front and a large gun facing to the rear. So joining me to tell the story of the development of the Archer is loyal patron of the show and author of Self Propelled 17-pounder Archer, Christopher Camfield. Chris, thanks for joining me. So before we get to the Archer, I was thinking about the development of self-propelled guns and self-propelled anti-tank guns. Had Britain and the Commonwealth experimented with self-propelled guns in that interwar period?
I don't know about any self-propelled anti-tank guns, but we do have in the 1920s, there's a lot of experimentation going on with mobile armored forces, and there's a real split within the army between the people who are really pro-tank and pro-mobile forces, who are, I hesitate to use the word fanatic, but they're really gung-ho and very convinced of their way of thinking. And so then there are a series of tests of exercises in the mid to late 20s. And in some of those, the Royal Artillery employed this vehicle called the Birch gun, which had been developed using the 18-pounder. And I think, now here's another situation where I could be wrong, I think it could be either used as a field gun or as an anti-aircraft piece, but not specifically as an anti-tank vehicle. But really, the expectations for what they could do with it were too high, and the results of the exercises were kind of for the artillery were kind of a muddle, and they really abandoned the idea, or they didn't continue to investigate that per se. The Royal Artillery were really focused more, still at that point, on experimenting with a very large variety of vehicles, both tracked and wheeled, to try to determine what to replace horses with. What was going to be the towing vehicle for the guns in the future? There's a book that David Fletcher and another fellow, I think it's Philip Ventham, put together. They looked at dozens and dozens of different possible vehicles to use, but not in terms of a self-propelled vehicle. And then in the mid-1930s, the British developed the 2-pounder anti-tank gun. And of course, that starts to get used as a weapon on the tanks that are under development at the time, as well as a ground gun, I guess, colloquially. And then I don't know exactly when Portee vehicles come in.
Were they used in France in 1940, the Battle of France?
Yes, there's a variety of different Portee vehicles and guns that are being used in the Battle of France. Not just I think some 2-pounders, but also some of the smaller Hotchkiss French manufactured anti-tank guns that the British Army was using at the time. There's a fair variety. And then that carries through into the battle in North Africa, where even in Operation Compass, they're using 2-pounder guns on Portee. And that the Battle of Betaphum, which sort of ended the campaign against the Italians, not only with their tanks, there were also 2-pounder Portee vehicles that had made the trek across the desert to cut the Italians off.
I suppose we should qualify what they are for people who are not aware of them. How would you describe the Portee?
Right. Well, that was what would you call it? A lorry, I guess, in UK parlance?
Yeah. A truck, take your pick.
Which was set up to carry porter, coming from the French word to carry the anti-tank gun on the back, sometimes pointed forwards, sometimes pointed backwards. I think according to proper doctrine, they were supposed to be removed from the truck before they went into action. So they would just be used to carry the gun from place to place, then taken off and, properly situated and hidden so that it would be in cover or hard to see, but ended up also getting used just from the back of the vehicle because they could drive away quickly.
Yeah, I was sort of under the impression that's how they often got used, just sort of as this fast deployed gun. Post the fall of France, a committee was formed, the Bartholomew Committee, which am I right in suggesting that suggested armoured self-propelled guns? Have I got that right?
Yes. I know that the Germans had some 88 millimeter guns on half tracks, I think, that they used. And there must have been reports of that. And the British Army looked at that and saw, like, yes, we should have some of that as well. But the problem was that so much material had been left behind at Dunkirk that Britain was constantly playing catch up in terms of production, right? In case of any German invasion, they needed to just produce large numbers of some kind of anti-tank gun to use either in the UK or in North Africa. And they really just had to concentrate on manufacturing what they could without imposing production delays by changing factories from making 2-pounder guns to making 6-pounder guns or anything fancier like a vehicle.
In that instance, then, why not stick with the Porty? Why not sort of just use those rather than cut with something? Because they seem to tick boxes for ease of production.
That's true. There must have been, in part, a recognition that the losses from Porty vehicles was high. I mean, because in 1942, you get this small production of a vehicle called the Deacon, which was actually a purpose-built armored Porty vehicle for the 6-pounder gun. But I think by the time the 17-pounder comes along, it just weighs too much to be used properly from the back of a truck. I mean, it's something like, I'm going to get this wrong, but something like 3 tons. And theoretically, you could do it with, I mean, if you can build a 50-ton tank transporter, I suppose you could something to carry it. Then you can clearly do something which could carry an anti-tank gun. But really, the U.S. has entered the war by 1942, and that changes things because they have already decided that they want a self-propelled anti-tank gun for their tank destroyer forces, which they're developing in the spring of 1942. So that's sort of on the menu for the British Army to order if they want it. And they look at it and they say, like, yes, we want this. It's got the American 3-inch gun, which is all right, but they're planning to remove that gun and to put the 17-pounder in its place. So it's really, I guess, the opportunity of the U.S. entering the war and its greater manufacturing capabilities being online and available that Britain then decides, okay, let's take this opportunity.
What I find interesting as well, so we're looking at self-propelled sort of guns, and obviously, the Deacon is, as you say, it's built in the Matador, which is a truck chassis, which is a heavy truck. But that it still remains as being a truck. So when you start looking at discussing self-propelled guns, if you're putting the same gun in why do they just build tanks? I think is my question. What role are they saying has been different? They're getting quite close with some of the guns that wanted to put in things. You think, well, why don't we just stick with a tank?
Yeah, that is a good point. There's a little undercurrent. I have only got a little bit of record for this, but there's the Royal Armoured Corps looked at this with a certain amount of skepticism or feeling like now the Royal Artillery are encroaching on our territory. Because there's this one of these meetings in 1942 when they're discussing should we have 17-pounder self-propelled guns, the Royal Artillery representative says we're going to have some tanks with 17-pounder guns, so you don't need those, basically. There were a couple of things, though. So to begin with, the Royal Artillery existed and they had anti-tank guns, and the war in France and in North Africa, they had an experience which led to certain design philosophy or a certain set of criteria, what was the most important thing, what was less important, that would be different from tanks. So, I mean, the number one priority really was the ability to conceal the vehicle, because in North Africa, if anti-tank guns were spotted, they were basically prone to being attacked by everything. Whatever German air power was available, tanks, infantry, artillery, they received the lot. So that was that's a major difference. Later on, the idea of using a tank comes up in some of these meetings where there's a development of the Cromwell tank, which later got called the Challenger, the A30, not to be confused with the later tank. And there's a couple of points at which it's proposed, let's just use this A30 as a self-propelled anti-tank gun. But the answer always came back that it's just too tall. So it was too big a vehicle that could be seen too easily. and thus that didn't meet the anti-tank concealment requirement. And in the meantime, the philosophy was that the British Army had structurally, it had anti-tank regiments, so they were going to be present in an armored division to begin with. And so it just made sense that there should be some further mechanization there, that a self-propelled anti-tank gun should be provided just to be able to move the guns more quickly and to keep up with the tanks.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. They're coming up with this quite late, mid-war. They're starting to think about this, and as you point out, they manufacturing. It's difficult to quickly switch over, and if they were to design something completely new. So, did they have a tank design or a chassis that they could reuse, or were they looking to come up with something new?
No, they were really looking at it very pragmatically. They were looking at any existing chassis, I shouldn't say any existing chassis, any existing old tank chassis that can be used, that can be repurposed for self-propelled guns. Because at the time that sort of request goes out for like vehicle manufacturers, could you please provide us with a design? What's not mentioned are Cromwell or Churchill. And this comes up again later, that they don't want to take away production of vehicles that they think are going to be useful. But if there is manufacturing capability that's already been assigned to, say, produce Crusader tanks in a factory, it would be relatively simple to change that over to produce a self-propelled anti-tank gun based on that tank, because the facilities are already set up to make the chassis, to make the suspension components, the tracks, the engine, and so forth. Now, they did not come up with a good design for the Crusader, so that didn't happen. But with the Valentine, it did.
So the Valentine. How successful has the Valentine been as a tank? Because the Archer is going to be built on that chassis. So what's the Valentine like?
Well, it was an infantry tank, so it was designed as a sort of a budget vehicle by Vickers Armstrong. The early war Matilda II was, a really great armored vehicle with very heavy armor for the time, but it cost a lot to make in terms of material and manpower because, for instance, it had this cast nose with very heavy armor, but that still had to be ground down by hand because in some cases the castings would come out to be too thick. And so anyways, the Valentine was designed to be a less expensive but still effective vehicle. I wouldn't say it had the best war service up until the mid-war period. I mean, it was used fairly effectively in North Africa, but it would have been more useful if the 6-pounder gun had been available as a tank gun at that time. But it did keep soldiering on. I mean, you still get Valentine tanks continuing to be used in the Far East pretty much until the end of the war. And it was dependable, it was reliable. The British Army had discovered a suitable American engine, this Detroit Diesel 671, which could be used instead of a British engine. So that meant the production of those engines was safe from German bombing, and they just had to be transported only had to be transported across the ocean to arrive in the British factories where they could be put to use. So in terms of the chassis for a self-propelled anti-tank gun, it wasn't very fast, but it had a lot of the other characteristics that were good. I mean, effectively, the reliability. I mean, reliability had not been the Army's main focus early in the war, but it was through experience was coming to really understand how necessary it was to have vehicles that were not going to require a lot of maintenance, because any vehicle that was out for maintenance was not part of the effective fighting force at the time, in North Africa.
So is it a natural choice? Because what gun did it have on it? A 2-pounder originally?
A 2-pounder at that time,
it's
only a 2-pounder.
Big jump to put a 17-pounder on. Is it a natural choice?
You're right, not exactly a natural choice. And so that must have been why. I mean, it's not a very large vehicle. They decided to mount the gun backwards on the chassis, and that required, some structural changes. They had to put a heavier bulkhead in to support the gun between the compartment for the crew and the engine compartment. It's not clear to me exactly when, the general staff actually saw that the design was going to involve a gun facing backwards, but they seem to have accepted it fundamentally. I mean, the only quibble, I guess, in the first period is that by the end of 1942, it's sort of clear that it's not going to be quite as fast, or by the spring of 43, anyways, it's not going to be quite as fast as they want. And so they want to push on with trying to design something else as well, but that never actually goes anywhere.
I think the thing that strikes you when you essentially mount the gun facing backwards is the armour not at the wrong end of the vehicle.
Well, there's not a lot of armor on the Archer anyways, because the specification for the armor was only something like 20 millimeters. It was only supposed to be proof against machine guns, small arms, and shrapnel, more or less. So yeah, so in that sense, it didn't really matter. And since the philosophy was that this is just supposed to be a vehicle that drives to a gun position and then sits there and waits for the enemy to attack, the fact that the gun is facing backwards doesn't seem as big of a problem as it would be, because it's not designed to drive into the middle of battle.
Presumably you need some big wing mirrors for your driver to be reversing into the middle of a battle if you'd...
and an engine setup that was suited more to it.
A rear-facing periscope. What was the Archer like for the crew? Because it doesn't have a turret, is it? It's open tops, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. I think it was okay, depending on where you were from or how tall you were. I say that because there's various different stories about, whether or not the crew could all fit, or what the comfort level of the fighting compartment was. There's one report or a veteran recollection in which he sort of mentions casually that the commander of the gun detachment had to get out of the vehicle when they were going into action because there was just not enough elbow room, by the sounds of it. But these were Canadians who I think were all about 6 feet tall, by the sound of the thing. So if you were from the UK and sort of a more moderate height, I think it was all right.
Ever say it's a crew of 4?
Yes. Initially, they envisioned the manufacturer envisioned a crew of only 3, and that the driver would also act as the loader. But that was changed by the military specification. So you can see how initially the manufacturer imagined more space for the crew, and then the Army turned around and said, no, that's not acceptable. We're going to need to put a 4th crew in there. And so they could just barely fit, more or less, I think.
So you already pointed out the British are purchasing the M10, also purchasing the M10 tank destroyer. Did the Archer have any benefits over the M10?
A few qualified advantages, yes.
Is the M10 based on a Sherman?
Yes. So the M10 was based on a Sherman with a different turret, and then based on some fighting experience reports that the Americans had from the Philippines, there were some changes to the hull to give it this angled armor and so on. But the Archer had a little bit of an edge in terms of its cross-country ability due to the question of the balance of weight between the vehicle weight and the area under the tracks that would determine what's called ground pressure. And there are some reports that indicate that, the Archer's was lower, and so it had a better ability to go up hills and things like that.
The Sherman is quite a high tank. And I didn't check the heights, is the Archer a lower profile than the Sherman?
Yeah, yes, definitely.
Because it looks quite ungainly, does the M10? It
does depend on the environment in which you're fighting in, though, because all of these vehicles are being designed without specific reference to the environment in which they're fighting. So, for instance, one of the reports about the M10 that comes out of Normandy is that, actually, the fact that it's tall is relatively useful for firing over obstacles and wheat fields and so on. So, the difference in height was there, but how much that actually mattered in the time period when they were being employed, 1944, 1945, is another question, because by that point in time, the American and British armies and Canadian, we're all more or less on the offensive, and there aren't that many German counterattacks. I mean, obviously there's the Battle of the Bulge, which was the big one, but the nature of the war has changed from one with a lot of back and forth like the British saw in North Africa to one of overall steadily advancing attacks.
It would have been a great design for 1942 when they're sort of copying the Germans, where the British would gaily gallop into a armoured charge and be blown to pieces by the German artillery. And I wondered if that was actually what they designed, which is not what's happening in 1945. And I said, and at the same point, the German self-propelled guns are often employed as an infantry support weapon, weren't they, in attacks, which I guess you can't really use with the Archer.
Well, on the one hand, the German self-propelled guns are really sort of divided. They actually had a doctrinal divide between actual vehicles that were intended as infantry support, like the early Stug has got I believe a 75 millimeter howitzer, and it's really intended as an infantry support vehicle. And then they also developed these Panzerjägers, which are a lot more philosophically like the Archer. They're small, they have light armor, they're really intended just to fight tanks. But then as the war develops, those vehicles drop out of the way, and they put the 75 millimeter gun in the Stug. And so then its role is a bit blurred. Whereas the Archer, by virtue of its availability and the opportunity for its employment, does end up being primarily infantry support. I mean, provided there weren't anti-tank guns to knock them out, they were there. I mean, they could bolster the infantry division's anti-tank line if necessary, and they could basically act as an armored unit that was available to the infantry division.
So how was the infantry using if they're not, presumably they're not attacking with them, because otherwise the Archer would have to be reversing into action?
Well, or driving up and turning around. I mean, that is criticized in some of the reports and suggests that that's what they're doing. And I took a look at a lot of actions that the Archer was involved in, and the anti-tank gunners do not seem to have had a lot of qualms about doing more or less that. The very first engagement in Northwest Europe that I found was in the aftermath of the battle. Well, the period of the Battle of the Bulge, when the British and Americans and British, I should say, I guess, are pushing the Germans back, and 51st Highland Division is involved in operation to push south in the area of a town called La Roche-en-Ardenne. And the British infantry are advancing, and they've got some Sherman tanks with them, and a couple of those get knocked out, but there are a few Archers present. And the infantry are able to point out that there's a Panther tank behind, once they've identified where this fire is coming from, that there's a little bit of a Panther tank sticking out from behind buildings up ahead. And the Archer crew basically just drive their vehicle, I don't know if it was quite into the open, but they turn it around in place where they can fire at this exposed corner and hit the corner dead on, going through the lower hull and then knocking out the drive sprocket of the Panther. So it was safe from destruction behind the vehicle, behind that building, but now it was immobilized, and so it couldn't bring its guns to bear on the infantry. And there's all kinds of situations like that where the Archers are being deployed in a manner not at all consistent with this idea of just being driven up to a defensive gun line and then just waiting there.
But they're operated by the Royal Artillery, aren't they? So how difficult was it when they start arriving for Royal Artillery to convert to a tracked self-propelled gun? Does the Royal Artillery have to maintain them? Does the crews suddenly have to go, hang on, I've never looked after an engine before. I was towing things.
Right. I mean, this is one of the interesting things about studying the Archers, sort of seeing how the introduction of a new vehicle kind of has these ripple effects. Because they're in the the Northwest Europe campaign, there aren't that many new vehicles that get introduced during that period. A lot of the same equipment gets used from June 1944 onwards. Yeah, and so the artillery, Royal Artillery, did not necessarily have a cadre of anti-tank gunners who knew about tracked vehicles. I mean, there are, on the other hand, like in the field regiments, there would have been sextons driving around moving the 25-pounder guns. So those men would have been trained. But there was definitely a need to train personnel, and so there was this little detachment within the supply chain that was set up as effectively a school for members of the artillery to be trained in driving tracked vehicles and in doing maintenance. I mean, it's worth remembering that, I mean, aside from not necessarily knowing how to drive tracked vehicles, not everybody knew how to drive wheeled vehicles either at the point in time, right? And yeah, so there's this little detachment that acts as a school. And the first priority is to train people who've already got some M10 experience, and then to train like personnel who are new. And yes, they're training drivers, they're training maintenance personnel, I think also wireless instruction for those who haven't had it, because if you were the crew of a 17-pounder anti-tank gun, wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, it typically wasn't the case that you would have had a wireless SATA radio with your gun. The Royal Artillery were still using telephone signal cable to keep in contact, which is fine if you've just got a group of guns that are set in place and relatively close to each other and not driving far away from where the battery headquarters is.
As this arrived so late, these guys really couldn't have had much training on them. Am I right in saying they were issued sort of January 45, late 44, 45? So the guys training on them presumably have literally weeks to train on them before driving out?
Not very much time. I mean, in terms of at this school, the introduction in Northwest Europe starts in November 44. And the typical procedure was that just one small detachment from a regiment would be sent back at a time so that the overall regimental strength wasn't reduced by much at any point. And they would basically be going back for a week of training, and then they would come back with their new vehicles. That was still enough time basically to train people in driving the Archer. That was okay, really. And I suppose they would have also possibly had additional time to practice when they were back at their regiment, so long as they weren't in line. But no, it was not very long at all.
It is remarkably swift. They must have done a lot of learning on the job to fix all those little oddities that no doubt that they'd never bumped into in training. There's a rumour, isn't it, that the driver couldn't sit in position while the gun's being fired. Tell me about that. I think that's a cracker.
That rumour has had a long lifespan, and it also seems to have started pretty much before the vehicle's introduction to the regiments, because there's a late 1944 survey where a lot of people are asked for their feedback about the equipment they've got and so on in both the field and the anti-tank regiments. And at that time, the reports show that somebody said, I don't think that this is very safe as a driver for me to be sitting here.
So the driver sat right behind the gun, isn't he?
Yes. So he's sitting directly in line behind the gun. And so it's not surprising that men would look at this and say, like, ooh, I don't know about this. This seems pretty dodgy. But there was a kind of a frame behind the gun that was 15 inches from the breech. That also was that was the maximum recoil that was permitted, regulation. The regulations sort of stated that if the recoil, got to that distance, that the gun was to be declared out of service. Anyway, so the response at the time from the person giving the survey was basically, well, if the gun is recoiling that far, you've got bigger problems. Like maybe the gun's going to explode. I mean, worse to that effect. I mean, if the gun's recoiling that far, maybe it's going to explode, or I don't know what exactly, but there was like a more serious problem with the gun, and the driver doesn't really need to worry about it. But it was very close. There's this one veteran account from a fellow called Frank Whitehead that I discovered on the IWM website, and he mentions that the gun used to give him quite a headache. Imagine he has to sit there during any time the gun's being used, because the role of the driver in that situation was to basically wait for a command from the commander, whether it was to turn the vehicle or for them to power up the engine and just drive away to get out of the situation they're in, because maybe there's mortar fire coming down or something like that. So he has to sit behind the gun for all of this period, really.
He has to sit behind the gun facing the wrong direction, wondering what's going on. I think that must be the oddity. Yeah, he doesn't have any sort of situational awareness to say, "Oh, hang on, they're coming. I'll just get ready to go." He really has to be waiting for the call and probably part deaf after the gun's been rattling off just right behind his head. So did they see much action? I mean, they shipped to both Italy and Northwest Europe. Did they see much action?
In terms of anti-tank action, not as much as it would have been earlier, because the Germans were, basically just running out of tanks. But they definitely saw their share of action in support of the infantry, I would say. It depended to some degree on how the regiment treated them, because some regiments decided, well, we've got these very mobile self-propelled guns. That's great. Since they're mobile, we should keep those as a reserve, so that if there's trouble in any spot that we're defending, we can move the archers up and provide additional defense. And what I found was that in those cases, the archers didn't tend to see a lot of action because German armored counterattacks didn't often occur. But they're really more or less in the thick of it in a surprising number of situations. So in Operation Veritable, which was this big push to drive the Germans back to the Rhine in February 1945, you see them with 15th Scottish Division pushing into the town of Cleve. There's this surprise overnight brigade move where the brigade commander finds an opportunity to just push into the town with the infantry and a supporting armor, and does so. And so, some of those archers are thrust right into the middle of an urban battle. And I don't think that those archers as anti-tank guns really serve much of a role in that battle, but they're there. And I think members of the battery captured some German soldiers. But then, the division's forces push south from there, and the archers are involved in armored conflict. And in the meantime, 51st Highland Division is sweeping through areas south of the Reichswald Forest, and their archers see quite a lot of action, partly because the division has Churchill tanks assigned to it, but the Churchill tanks are not where these particular archers are, so the infantry don't have any other armored support, and they do run into German self-propelled guns, and the archers are there to counter their attacks. Or in one case I can think of off the top of my head, the troop commander on foot goes out looking for a route by which an archer can go in order to get in a position to shoot a German self-propelled gun that's not going anywhere at the time, and then they go and do exactly that and knock out the German self-propelled gun. Further on, there's some Canadian archers which are involved in an engagement where they, by virtue of the fact that the Royal Artillery had a philosophy of staying with the infantry even overnight, the archers are then in position to knock out a number of Panther and Jagdpanthers, which the Germans are using to assault this Canadian infantry position.
Actually, it's a bit of a box ticker for your Varsity, Plunder, Veritable, Battle of the Bulls. They sort of were, maybe not in great numbers, but they seem to have been everywhere. Were many problems found with the Archer once it goes into the service into the field? It's a late design. It's sort of brought out quite quickly. Were there niggly points that people complained about?
A variety. I mean, if we go back to the development period, the one real miscalculation that the designers made was they didn't anticipate some issues with the balance of the gun on the chassis, so that a special power traverse system had to be added to the vehicle design, and that pushed the production of the vehicle back by about 4 months to get that right. There were a variety of issues, some small, some large, that were discovered by crews in the field. For instance, one of the things that wasn't really thought about was that when you've got a diesel engine which is off, and then you start it up again because you want to move the vehicle or you want to turn the Archer because it couldn't turn without the engine being on, the diesel tended to produce a whole pile of bluish smoke. Initially, the exhaust pipe of the Archer was turned upwards. So the result would be you turn the engine on, and it creates this column of blue smoke going up into the air, which sort of signals like, oh, here I am. So, your Archer might be wonderfully hidden behind an embankment or bushes or whatever, but this is a dead giveaway. And so, this was something that was looked at as to what, could we possibly use a little bit of petrol instead of diesel fuel? Would that produce less smoke? But no real solution to producing the smoke was ever found. They did take the step of turning the exhaust downwards so that it would just create more of a cloud of smoke along the ground. But that's just an example of a small detail that wasn't appreciated at the time that the vehicle was designed.
Loyal listener, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm discussing the self-propelled £17 Archer with Chris Camfield. How long did the design last in the post-war world? Because the Valentine, actually, I buffing up at the Valentine, actually continued into the 60s in various armies throughout the world. So how long does the Archer last post-war? Is it a popular design?
Well, it lasted the British Army until about 1955. And at that point in time, as it's being really taken out of service, I can talk more about its service within the British Army. Up until that point, quite a few get sold to Middle Eastern countries like Jordan and Egypt. And at that point, it is difficult to do research to find out when those vehicles were actually replaced. I don't even care to speculate, particularly. 1955 or 56 with the Suez Crisis is the last evidence I could find of the Archer being used in combat.
So the British Army continued to regularly ship them around post-war up until sort of 55.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at where they were being sent to. A few of them were sent to Hong Kong in 1949 when there was fear that the communists were going to menace the colony. And they also made it out into North Africa in the 50s as part of a sort of a divisional regiment of effectively tanks at that point in time to support an infantry division. And there were also some in Germany as well.
It's funny that post-war they get shipped to Africa, which is what they were originally designed for and never really went there during the war. And it strikes you, I might be wrong, but Hong Kong doesn't necessarily strike me as tank country to send them to, which even on the mainland Hong Kong, it's a bit of a odd place to ship them other than to say we've shipped something there. Which is an interesting one. Because I presume as well, you start to have it makes you wonder, you start to have a problem with supply because presumably, how do you repair them? And then when you sell them to third parties, who do the British Army continue, whoever makes them, Vickers Armstrong, they produce parts for them? Or do they use ex-army stock, of which once it's gone, it's gone?
Yeah, supply of spares exercised a lot of power, I suppose, had a lot of influence in the post-war period. I mean, the British Army still had a lot of M10s, but they couldn't as easily acquire spare parts. And so the M10s were kept on as, I think the military term used is a wasting asset. That is to mean that, we'll keep using them so long as we can get the spare parts for them, but because they weren't getting more spare parts, the use of them just continued to trail off. Whereas Vickers Armstrong was still in the UK, and I don't know whether there was a larger stockpile of Valentine spare parts, but it was comparatively easy to get replacement parts. And then the Archers that were sold to Egypt get captured by Israel because of the not wonderful relationship between Israel and the UK at that point in time. I guess they couldn't get any spare parts for them, and so they decided, well, we can't use these.
How did you bump into the Archer? I'd never heard of them. So where did your interest stem?
Well, I read about them. They get chapters or sections in other books about the Valentine tank. And I was in a situation where I was researching stuff in Canada, and as somebody in the UK was willing to do research in exchange for me. And I thought, what am I going to do with it? This is a wonderful opportunity, but what should I do with it? And it just struck me that nobody in 75 years at the time had ever really spent time looking at this. And I thought, well, here's something I can research, hopefully write a book about, and present something that's a little different instead of, I could try to write another book about a tank that's already been well covered by probably David Fletcher or somebody like that. But, that's just going to be sort of reheating the same, a rehash of previous material. And I thought, here's the opportunity to do something new.
It's fascinating, A, because most people have never heard of it, and B, because it is quite, I don't know if I was going to say it's quite unique. I assume it's unique. I can't imagine there was many tanks that essentially have a rear mounting gun. I'm not sure if you can call it rear mounting, because just because the driver faces the opposite direction, it drives in the different, which is the front, which is the back. But anyway.
Yes, indeed.
It's such an interesting vehicle because it's such a slightly odd one. Yet the funny thing is, when you see it, it doesn't look odd at all. It kind of looks normal. Although then you realise that actually it's driving backwards when you see it on the road. Well, anyway.
Exactly.
You get it.
Yeah, and that's even something I sometimes struggled with in describing the vehicle in the book. If I'm trying to say which side of the vehicle somebody sits on, is that the left side or the right side? It depends on whether you're looking in the same way as the vehicle drives or if you're looking in the same direction as the gun shoots.
Yes, is the front where the gun points, the front where the driver looks. And I guess the driver will always think he's looking at the front and the gunner will always think he's looking at the front, which could get quite confusing. So have you got any more books on the way?
Yes, I have more ideas than I have time. The book that I'm working on next is going to be about the M10 in British and Canadian service. I think that will be a more popular topic than the Archer, for what that's worth. But more to the point, having looked at the Archer and British anti-tank forces, I think it makes sense for me to tackle that next if I'm ever going to do it. So the M10 next, because I can leverage a lot of the research that I've already done in terms of the artillery and anti-tank artillery as an institution, so to speak. After that, I would love to start getting into armored cars. So those are sort of my plans, and that should last me a good long time, I think.
Yes, well, I look forward to discussing the M10 and armoured cars with you at some point in the future. Chris, thanks for your time. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about the Archer, and it is worth looking at some photos to see what it looks like, Chris's book is Self Propelled 17-pounder Archer. Now, Chris was the 6th patron of the show. He signed on in 2016. Now, if you would like to join Chris and other patrons of the show and enjoy advert-free listening and extras, which I have from time to time, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast to support the show. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. So that is it for this time out. Next time, I think we might be looking at a very obscure corner of the war, scientists working for the Royal Navy. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.